Good morning, everyone.
Good
Good
morning.
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 I would like to call to order this first special meeting of 2021 to discuss broadband telecommunications. Thank you all. And I'm just going to double check our agenda, if we have a pledge on it or not today.
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. So let's do that. Do we have a flag available?
There we go.
Great, thank you. And then what I was going to suggest is that from now on, we each take a turn reciting the pledge, and that way we don't talk all over each other, and the rest of us just talk silently with our mute on, if that's okay. So who wants to take it today? I'll do it.
Okay.
All right. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all. And who wants to do it next time?
I'll do it next time.
Great. All right, well, let's get started. So our agenda today is very simple. It's basically to go over a variety of topics which I've prepared some talking points, and I'm sure others have. So maybe what would be beneficial would be to for us all to take a moment to talk about the subjects under the subject of broadband and telecommunications that we'd like to cover today. I've got a list here which I'm going to pull up, but if someone else, Mike or Christine, if you want to list some items, and I'd also be open to hearing from staff on topics that we should cover today in our conversation.
Great. Should we just say what's on our mind at all, or take turns?
What I was going to suggest is what's on your mind about what you'd like to discuss today. Here we go.
Right. Okay.
So actually, I've got a list that I'd be glad to go over, and then we can see if it's covered.
Yeah. Why don't you start?
Okay, great. So on my list is, and by the way, everyone, there's no particular order for these items. They're just a list of stream of consciousness that I put together. So on that list is speed testing, the dig once policy, open access, buried instead of aerial distribution of fiber, construction of fiber, leasing from customers, meaning how do we work with potential cooperators and competitors, developing a business model for the PUD's involvement, discussing some of the implementation issues like multi-mode versus single mode, the number of wavelengths and strands that are used for distribution, net neutral control agreements, and then again, very much part of the business model too, it would be a dark fiber leasing, dark fiber versus lit fiber leasing, and then insurance and other administrative issues around that. So this is a big list. This is we could spend days discussing all of these topics, but these are the topics I came up with in a brainstorming session with myself. So.
Can I go next?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So on my list would be an update from my conversation with Mayor Fleetwood about the City of Bellingham Broadband Advisory Group. Number 2 would be talking about grants and other competitive sources of funding that are likely to be available soon or available now, and how we prepare to maximize getting that funding to our community. 2 is a discussion about the Mason PUD fiber hoods model and what last mile fiber could look like, including a business model and a discussion about COS Systems, which is a consulting firm that Mason PUD used, and possibly going to the EDI about that. And also talking about piloting last mile fiber in with either Cherry Point, Blaine, or Sumas, which we can get into why those areas are priorities potentially. And then any way that the commission can help with the telecom hire. And I'll stop there. So we don't have a 5-hour meeting.
Yeah, or 5-day. So Mike, what are your thoughts about what you'd like to cover today?
My list is a little different. Part of my list is going to be talking about our past. Now, years ago, the PUD had a vision of providing broadband throughout Whatcom County. We had the idea that if you build it, they will come. And instead, what I believe I remember happened is we had most of the community, in my mind, turn against us on it. The support wasn't there. Even the desire to see a need for it wasn't there. So I'd like to talk a little about where are we at today. You know, are people really going to support us? Are we going to, they're going to get behind us? So I'm really interested in what the two of you and the others feel about that. And if that's true, if we have the support, then what's our next step? Because our first thing we're going to face is cost. Our first thing we're going to face is coming together. Will Bellingham support us? They already have a system in place. Sounds like if we connect to their system, we could move a lot quicker than trying to reinvent everything. So I don't have the kind of list. Both of your lists are very good and I'm interested in hearing them. I just want to know is how do we get to there? How do we accomplish that?
Thank you, Mike. So it occurs to me that in terms of thinking through the input of all the commissioners, I see a certain organization in the input. Mike, you're asking a lot of questions of kind of foundational, where we at, and then Christine, the questions that you're raising is some of the things that are happening currently and how we're relating to other entities proceeding. And my questions are more technically oriented. So I think that what I'd like to suggest is that we start with Mike's items, and then we move on to, I think one thing that'd be really helpful if I could suggest is that we start with a report on meetings. And I neglected to mention that I did have a conversation with Michael Lilliquist, which I'd like to report on. So I would just suggest the following agenda for today. The first is to catch us all up to speed on conversations and meetings we've all had on the subject. And then the second step is to talk about the where we're at, and maybe if I may add to your words, Mike, lessons learned. And then move on to some of the things that the items that Christine referred to as what other organizations are doing and what we might look to from them for a model. And then if there's anything that pertains in the list of items that I came up with, which, like I said, were far more technical, I'll bring it up as appropriate. But that'll be a full agenda for today, I think. Mm-hmm. So with that, Christine, could you talk about your meeting with the mayor, and then I'll talk about my meeting with Michael, and if Mike, if you have any conversations you've had that would be helpful, let's talk about that. And then also with staff has something in that category, that'd be great to hear too. So Christine, you go first though.
Yeah, so the brief update is that the mayor sees a value, a strong value in having the PUD involved in the broadband advisory group. But the resolution as it's currently written does not allow elected officials to be voting members of the broadband advisory group. And so he thinks that there's a possibility that that could be changed. I would say, had an informal conversation about it. I let him know that there would be a memo from our staff going to his staff with a more formal request. And that, he would like to figure out how to work together. And it was we kind of left it there. But the big issue is that elected officials are not intended to be voting members at this time, but there's a possibility to change it.
So the question is, what's the will of the commission on this issue? Because we passed a resolution. And so the resolution, you conveyed the message of the resolution. And so the question is, if that doesn't work for the city, what do we do then? So that's an important question. Meaning, how important is it for us to have a voting membership role on the committee?
One thing I have not, oh, go ahead, Mike.
Well, maybe I can ask the two of you because you have more knowledge and you've talked to more of the mayor as well as the city council. Do either one of you, can you tell me what their goal is? Are they trying to go independent from the rest of us? Are they wanting to be separate from Whatcom County? Do they want their own system? Do either one of you know? Because it sounds like already I'm hearing some roadblocks. I understand, Christine, you said that the mayor will, take it in consideration or maybe make changes in the future, but the two of you are very knowledgeable, but because you hold public offices, are going to possibly stop the two of you from being a part of make possibly a solution to the city of Bellingham?
So what I would say is the palette. Christine, am I cutting you off?
No.
Okay, so I just wanted to make sure. And of course on Zoom, it's sometimes a little bit hard, and I apologize, and please interrupt me, anybody, if needed. I understand the parliamentary procedure quite well. I've been through lots of training on the subject, but in that work session like this, we're having a conversation. So let's just make sure that when we're doing these relatively informal work sessions, that we don't miss the opportunity to get ourselves heard. So a city has a big palette of issues, and fiber broadband is just one of them. The reason they're making a priority of this issue is because people in the community, most notably John Humphreys, has made it a priority to discuss it, and then campaigned the city council members quite intensely to get them to make a priority of the issue. I would say that the city was not planning to do anything in the area of fiber until those efforts are made. I'm not at all unhopeful about the city, but that's the practical reality. So I don't expect the city to be all of a sudden a leader in the subject of fiber optic. I expect them to be constructively engaged, and this community will help them do that. So for that reason, I personally don't believe that our votes are that important. I may be missing something, and I'm fully open to that.
Sorry, did you say you don't think our votes are that important?
No, it's one of many, and
yeah,
and frankly, it's what we do that matters, not what we say in this particular context. Because working with the port, we could probably get things done more quickly than we can at the city. But I don't know. It's hard to predict the future, being involved is important.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Mike.
Oh, sorry. So are you saying, O'Toole, that I guess it's going to be what, us in the port, and we shouldn't think that the city's going to be involved with us? They're going to go their own way and we should go our own way? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that the city is not the center of effort on the subject. So I'm saying that it's more likely that the PUD and the port are at the center of the effort, and then that the city is cooperating with what's happening at the port and the PUD. That's probably more realistic.
My sense too is that I don't know that the city of Bellingham has a strong vision for what they want right now. It's part of why they formed this group. And so if we believe that we can add value to the work that they're trying to do, which I think in general is to make broadband more accessible and more affordable and increase competition, if we can help them, I think they're very open to it. My sense from the discussions I've had with various people at the city over the last few months is that they understand there's a problem, but they don't yet know what the solution is. And so I agree with the tool that being a voting member might not be the most important thing. What's important is that we start creating, that we create something that can help solve the problem.
Yeah. So yeah, I would summarize that by saying it's our ideas that matter. The city is physically, financially, in every way a bigger and perhaps slower moving organization than the PUD. So it's our ideas that are going to have the biggest effect on the people in the city in Bellingham, probably.
It's interesting because if I remember, Steve, you might have to step in on this one, but it's because of our past and our energy the PUD has done is, I think, the reason they have a leg up, because I think they purchased our infrastructure and they are working off of it. So I guess I would say the PUD, I believe, is the one who put Bellingham on the map when it came to broadband. Steve, am I right?
You're muted, yeah.
Sorry about that.
No.
I'll let Brian respond to that better, but I mean, initially, you're right, Mike. I mean, it's the opportunity that the PUD offered to the city when we decided to dispose of the equipment and the infrastructure that we had in place. I mean, that really gave the city the opportunity to jump in and take advantage of that. But they moved beyond that. You know, in terms of the internal use of fiber for the internal systems. But Brian, maybe you can jump in on that.
Well, yeah, just to support what you said, Steve, we had originally purchased fiber ring around Bellingham from Vista Communications. That fiber ring, 144 count fiber ring, is what the city started building off. They purchased it from us and started doing extensions off that ring. In fact, before we went out of business, we worked with the city and on some of those extensions. So we were able to extend that fiber to some schools, to Western Washington University, and some other locations. So you're right, Commissioner Murphy. They springboarded off of the fiber we had purchased from Vista, then sold to them.
Are they still, Brian, are they still in that basement on C Street in that building where we were at? Or have they moved?
As far as I know, they still have a presence in that co-location center on C Street.
Yeah.
As part of the sale of our assets, we also basically transferred our lease rights to that building.
Okay. Thanks for the information.
So thank you, Christine, for that. Is it appropriate for me to move on then? I'll move on to my the next conversation about a meeting. I had a brief meeting with Michael on Sunday. We talked about the same subject. Obviously, Christine and I aren't allowed to talk, so there's a little bit of duplication that happens. So I won't repeat that. What did happen is that I brought up the subject of of our participation and also our, voting, non-voting. Well, he explained to me that he believed that the city council was very open to making adjustment changes, including ideas for the PUD to be a more active role in the city's committee, maybe even co-leading it. So that is a subject that I mentioned in public comment at a city council meeting before the end of the year. That the PUD is interested in being involved in the committee in a variety of different ways and would like to discuss that. Unfortunately, that was very late in their process. Comment that I made, but a city continues to be open to the subject of the PUD's involvement in a variety of ways. I just my only concern is to not, even though I raised the issue.
Atul, you froze up right now, your video.
Michael, it could be something that could be introduced at a future committee meeting at the city that created the broadband committee. So,
Atul,
yes.
we lost you there for a few seconds, so.
Okay, so where was I when you lost me?
I think you were just talking about the idea or the response from Michael that he sees PUD having even a more active role, possibly even.
He's open to that.
Yeah.
He's open to it. I'm not saying, and we both talked about, we don't want to delay the committee getting on with its work, but perhaps some of that could be ad hoc and doesn't need to be new resolutions, I guess is what I'm saying. Is if we have good ideas, we've got good ideas. If we don't, we don't, and go ahead, Christine.
My only concern is having been part of the Climate Action Task Force, which seems somewhat similar to this group, co-facilitating seems like a tremendous amount of work. We would need, I really would feel strongly that we would need to hire a third party to help facilitate, just because there's so much going on with that. And as many of you have heard from me, and I will say this again and again, process is not product. And I worry that this could become a process intensive process. So yes, I want us to be involved, but I think we need to be really careful, especially given that we are a small and nimble staff without a full-time person dedicated to this work yet. So that's my only concern about co-facilitating.
What I'd like to do is make sure I hear from everybody at the PUD on the subject of that we're, you're meeting with Seth, my meeting with Michael. And then I'd like to return to have a conversation about our resolution and whether we want to modify it or, make a clarification statement. So anybody else have any other important meetings relating to this subject? Okay, then let's return to the subject of the resolution. So we passed a resolution, of course, and that's in our minutes and all of that. And so we could either do one of two things. We could clarify to the city that we did pass the resolution, but we're willing to go ahead and support the committee ideas. Let's get to work. That kind of a statement. Or we could amend the resolution. I'd like to see what the thoughts of the commission are, and then hear from staff. Go ahead, Mike.
I support the resolution because of the experience, the knowledge the two of you have, and thought that it would benefit not only the city of Bellingham City Council, but also the community with both your experience on fiber. And so I thought our resolution was pretty good. I still would like to see actually both of you involved in WAVE, whether it's the voting or non-voting. because of your experience and knowledge. I don't know who they're putting on these committees, especially the voting membership, to know if they have actually the background and the knowledge needed to make good decisions to support the city council. Do you have any idea who the voting members might be?
Christine, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, so I have all their names right here. I think, Steve, you may have sent out the names on the city council meeting notes don't give their background on who they represent. So you'd have to do a little bit more digging, and some people in the community have already done that digging. And I think Steve was the one that sent me a link to that. So Steve, maybe you could send that to Mike. I don't have it pulled up right now, but yeah, I mean, it's a mix of different community members that have various technical backgrounds and affiliations. I don't know who the ex officio members are, because on this January 12th meeting notes, they only list the voting members.
Okay, so if I can interrupt, the ex officio members are very much up in the air.
Okay.
And the reason they're very much up in the air is because the city council was concerned about the number of, and particularly Michael was concerned amount of telecom industry people that were in that category, including one lobbyist for the telecom industry that was in that category. And that concerned Michael, and it concerned the other city council members. So they didn't finalize the list of ex officio members. I have looked at the members who are voting, and they do seem to cover a range of backgrounds, including technical people who understand fiber and broadband. So I do believe they're qualified people, and I do believe that the voting members are also what I would call unbiased. So doesn't mean that they are perfect, but there's a competent group of people in the voting members.
Okay, so are the two of you maybe recommending we change the resolution a little then?
I don't think we can change a resolution. I'm not sure.
Well, no. Okay, there's your answer. John's gonna come in.
Yes, John, would you like to
I
address?
just want to say, technically, it wasn't a resolution because there was nothing written. There was a resolution that the commission resolved and commission cited. It was a motion giving direction to the staff and the talking points, if you will, small t, small p, for Commissioner Grant when she met with the mayor. So if you wanted a new direction, it's a discussion point, and then if you want to formalize it, you would just do it in the form of a motion.
Yeah. So what you're saying, John, is that we could amend a motion effect or clarify a motion that was passed previously, but the motion still stands.
The motion still stands in the direction, and I think it was a motion. Maybe Steve can correct my recollection. But if you wanted to take a new direction, you just pass a new direction. You know, we're going to give a new information. We're going to seek a non-voting ex officio position on the city's broadband committee. I mean,
Okay.
it's rather informal here at this point because it wasn't a formal resolution. And
Okay,
it
thank
wasn't
you.
a binding motion for a contract or something.
Okay, thank you.
Have we, can I ask?
Yeah.
Have we already sent a memo to the mayor's office? No.
No.
Okay. Okay.
So what I would entertain is a new, sorry, go ahead, Steve.
I get just a comment, and when we talked at your last meeting, the question that I raised is, I think that Commissioner Grant and Commissioner Gismani's comments this morning about the meeting with the mayor and with Council Member Lillquist is, what do you see as a commission, as a PUD? What do you see your efforts on the city's committee, advisory committee to be? What do you want to accomplish? And I mean, I think that really should be reflected in your motion and your position, you know, is do you want to have the PUD participate in that discussion as it might benefit the PUD's direction on its own and work with the port so that you can bring back whoever it is, whether it's a commissioner or whether it's staff, you can bring back to the PUD some, information and learning as to what the city is doing. And that's really, or do you want to try to sway, the decisions that come out of that committee? I mean, there's a difference. And I think that's, what do you want to accomplish by being on,
Right.
whether it's voting as a voting member or an ex officio or whatever?
So, great. And I love how you always emphasize what's the question, Steve. I always appreciate that. And so, and exactly that's the question. So the question I would suggest to answer you is that I think the PDs, although we had prior activities, the newest entrant into this conversation. I think it's really our ideas that we need to be able to share at the city. And so I think it doesn't matter whether we're voting or non-voting to be able to do that, as long as we're allowed to speak. That's what matters. And so I think I'd like to suggest that we go ahead and proceed and say, given current information, the city's already appointed the committee, that the PUC proceed with being involved, and maintain the same representation, or if we want to change it, that's fine too. Proceed with being involved with the committee and not require voting membership to participate. Go ahead, Mike.
I'm trying to remember the motion we made, but I thought it was requesting for you, O'Toole, to sit on the voting membership. Is that
Right.
correct?
May
Yes.
I read the motion that was made from the draft minutes? Would that help?
Thank you, Ann.
The motion was made to, one, make the request to the council that the PUD commission have a voting member from the commission to the Bellingham Broadband Advisory Committee. Two, that Commissioner Deshmani be the designated PUD representative. And three, staff prepare a letter to the mayor and council expressing rationales for this request, focusing on the countywide issue to be signed by commission president.
Thank you. O'Toole?
Yes, please.
From what Ann read, I like what she says. I look at it this way: if one of you are not on that voting membership, then it just drops down. Otherwise, they'll have an opportunity for the public to speak. Then they'll have an opportunity for the non-voting members to speak, which I think is a level above that. And then the level above that will be the voting members, which the city council, I believe, will actually sit around with and work with them to make the final decision that the city council will vote on. If that is true, what I'm saying, then having one of you being there is very, very important. I don't think that we as a community of Whatcom County can move forward without all players joining hands and moving together. So even if the city wants to go on their own or maybe take a different direction, it takes a voice like yours and Christine's to be there to say, hey, look, here's the bigger picture. Because we're there representing Whatcom County, not just the PUD. Is that correct? You two agree?
Yes, I do. I'm fine with that. So sounds to me that we're what you're suggesting, Mike, is that you think it still makes sense to hold to that and ask the city to just add one more member to the voting members in an upcoming meeting. And there's no, and Michael did, I forgot to mention this. Michael did mention that there's no hard restriction in the original resolution on the number of voting members. So for that reason, that may be the easiest fix, particularly since they haven't selected the non-voting members yet. Anyway, so this might be actually the easiest way forward for the city as well.
Okay.
Okay, let's move on then, I'd like to suggest. Okay, well, the next item that wanted to talk about, are there any other meetings that we've had? Steve, you have a regular meeting with the port, and I want to see if there's any other meetings that would be relevant to the broadband telecom subject.
Commissioners, we normally have a weekly meeting with Gina Stark at the port this last Monday, yesterday. We did not have that meeting, so I don't have anything to report.
Okay. Okay. Well, then let's move on to the conversation that Mike was asking for, which is our where we are at, what our history has been on this, and what Mike, would you please rephrase that for us?
Well, in the past, the PUD you want me to go all the way back, like to the vision that the PUD had, and we started out with a broadband?
That would be wonderful, because neither one of us were here. Neither were here.
Well, we did, the commissioners back then, as well as the general manager, we did see the need for broadband in Whatcom County. In fact, at the time, and Steve he knows the history very well. Brian, you know too. We had an opportunity at one time to possibly support industry coming into, maybe industry is the wrong word, into Cherry Point. And the problem with our community is we didn't have broadband to offer to draw in clean industry, if you even want to call it. Actually, I think it was Nike. Someone wants to remind me if they know that's true. I think it was Nike. And they were talking about 10,000 jobs, if I remember correctly. So after that more or less failed, we thought it was important for us to do something about that, the PUD. So we stepped up to it and tried to take it on. I believe that was the beginning of it. Brian and Steve, you can join in because you probably know the history. I know you weren't there part of it. I don't believe. Brian, were you? I can't remember.
Yes, Brian was there from the beginning.
Okay, I'm sorry, Brian.
Just happened in the beginning. No, I would say the seed that was our beginning in telecom came out of the PUD Association.
Yes, that's true.
And in conversation with Bonneville Power Administration, Bonneville at the time was stringing fiber optic cable along their transmission corridors, and had made an offer to the PUDs and other municipal and co-op utilities to lease spare fiber strands in their cable for their own use within their communities. And the PUD got involved in anticipation that Bonneville would be extending that fiber into Whatcom County and in the near term. And so the PUD actually, established their telecom utility, and the initial vision was somewhat similar to what the port started out with, but the vision was to extend fiber throughout the county in a planned, staged manner, and also to establish a coalition of public agencies to guide the development of that network of fiber, and to possibly be co-funders, help make decisions of where the fiber should run, what facilities should be connected. So initially it was a public effort to build out fiber in the county, spurred by Bonneville making fiber available that could be the backhaul fiber for the community fiber.
And I remember that. Thank you, Brian, because I remember PUD got involved. I think legislature allowed PUDs to get involved. So we became a member to the telecom, if I remember. And so there was all these little steps. I guess I only shared one step, and you shared the rest.
Yeah.
So, and then Homeland Security, actually, I know you say Bonneville, but Homeland Security, I think, took over a lot of the fiber that came up this way too, which, if I remember, you'll have to remind me, stopped fiber being shared with outside. Is that correct?
No, I think Homeland Security got involved in laying their own fiber. Really, I think the initial start of that was that laying that fiber all across just along the border on 8th Street, and then connecting their camera system, the security systems all the way up past Glacier. I think that's where they got involved.
Okay. All right, I apologize. You know, that all this happened quite a few years ago, and I'm searching my dusty memory and cleaning off the files to see if I can remember everything. So
Yeah, in those early days also, that's when NOAA was also formed, and
That's right.
all the PUD, I would mostly, from my recollection of meetings at WAPUDA, is that the PUDs that constitute the majority of fiber activity done by PUDs all started early on at that time. There's been a few PUDs that have gotten involved later, for sure, but there was a core group of PUDs that started pursuing this across the state, and I don't know if other PUDs exited the space besides us. I don't know any stories of that. But when I became a commissioner, I met with Brian and we talked about lessons learned from our experience in the foray with fiber. And the central message that I got out of that's really stuck with me in the lessons learned was understanding the load, the utilization, and being able to actually put the fiber to use. And I understood something slightly different from what you said, Mike, about the community. From what I understood is that businesses in the community who had a competing interest worked to undermine the PUD's interest in their favor. And through a variety of tools, through public records requests and other tools, they were able to know our plans and the PUD's plans and be able to interfere with the execution of those plans. So that was another factor too. But the single biggest factor was that we didn't understand what the utilization of the infrastructure we were building was going to be. Brian, would you like to add to that as far as lessons learned?
Yes, Commissioner. And from my perspective, and I came on board, probably the second year after the Infinite telecom utility had been formed within the PUD. But the PUD had a vision, a good vision of the build out of publicly owned and operated fiber in the county. And as I said earlier, it had attempted to form a coalition of public agencies that had a similar shared vision. But early on in the process, the PUD, because of the difficulty, as you're aware of, forming coalitions is not an easy task. But the PUD abandoned that effort and went on its own. And so that was one of the lessons learned to me, is that they abandoned that original vision and in terms of having a coalition of public agencies. And one of the reasons they did was they had an opportunity to buy that fiber ring in Bellingham. So they kind of shifted focus to acquiring Vista Communications assets and using as a base to build out the network without the public coalition. And as Commissioner Desmani just said, then they started running into opposition with the local telecom providers because the PUD's model started looking like their model and that they're in direct competition. So they had this backwash of controversy and actual private telecom providers trying to thwart the PUD's efforts, them forward.
Commissioners, I think that those last comments by Brian are to me at least, are the key issue here, is that the PUD had developed not a business model, but a public open access fiber optics network public agencies really to utilize. And when they abandoned that in an attempt to try to build at least the initial infrastructure around, I'll quote, a business model, just what Brian said. Now they found themselves in competition with the private, and that simply was not going to work because we didn't have the customer base that was going to support that. And I think that abandoning that idea of building a countywide public open access network is something that we, to move this idea forward, I think that's what I think you need to take another look at. To go back to that, I mean, it's building coalition is one thing, but I think the idea that Tom Anderson and the commission then developed was a good one, but there simply wasn't a revenue base that was going to support that. And without having developed a vision that the public agencies, the cities, the library system, the county couldn't, quote, commit to, they weren't able to do that. I mean, I sat on that advisory committee to Tom and folks here at the PUD from the small cities group at the time. And I mean, the other agencies simply weren't ready for that. And so then the PUD was not willing, and this is not a criticism, but the PUD was not willing to say, okay, we're going to find a way to start building out this public network, and we'll have to figure out how to fund it, but this is what we're going to do. And we backed, the PUD backed away from that.
And if I could add to that, the minute we backed away from that public coalition, we lost the opportunity for sharing costs, for sharing funding opportunities. The PUD then had to rotate to really a private model, revenue-based approach that required a certain number of connections to the network to fund the effort. And the number of connections required to cover costs were never realized. Plus, it made the privates nervous because now we've got a connection model requiring connection fees and revenue just like they were doing.
Say, Brian?
Okay.
Yep. Yes, Commissioner?
Well, I guess it's not. Wasn't it called Vista or something like that? The system that we purchased that was already in place, something like that called Vista or some, I don't know why that word's coming to my mind, but.
Yeah, we bought it from Vista Communications, which was a subsidiary of the Vista utility, the private utility in Spokane.
And what I remember was that we bought it because we were not getting the support from the community, as Steve kind of talked about. Nobody really wanted to come forward. We had the opportunity when that came open to buy it on pennies on the dollar. And we thought it was going to be our hub to start out into the county. I don't ever remember us saying we were going to make Bellingham our focus against the competition of the private businesses in that area. It just happened to be that's where the hub was in Bellingham.
It was that Vista offered that ring for a very attractive price. So the thinking was there was an opportunity there that we could springboard off of. Also, having a presence and a co-location center in Bellingham meant we had access to backhaul. We had access to fiber that would get us to Seattle and elsewhere in the state. So
I think the thinking was at the time there could be connection between schools, financial institutions, and the rest within the Bellingham hub that could generate some revenue in the process. The legal difficulty in the nuance was the PUDs don't have retail authority. So you couldn't provide the service to the entity, but you provided the connectivity. And so the private providers would say, why am I paying the PUD to lease fiber when I can build it cheap. I mean, there was a guy who had his own truck and would buy fiber and would just one of the service providers and would just go run fiber. He had pole attachment agreements with PSC, so he'd just go out and run his own truck and run the fiber to connect his customers. And so there was, when you entered into saying we're going to provide the backbone within the city, there was too much competition to get to the retail providers. And they'd say, why am I paying the PUD for the fiber access when I can provide it myself?
Keep in mind also, at the same time, you had a lot of push from the privates, going to our state legislature and making sure that PUDs did not get retail authority. State Representative, our friend from south of here, was one of the key pushers on that legislation. And also keep in mind that today we have a bill that's being heard, I think, this week from State Senator Doug Erickson, the same thing. Make sure that PUDs do not get retail authority. So there was a lot of outside push at that same time, as Brian, recalled what was going on here, from our state legislators and from the privates to keep the PUDs from competing with the privates. So
Yeah, on
So-
that sub, sorry, go ahead, Mike.
I'm sorry, it's your meeting, I'm sorry. I was actually going to turn to you and Christine, because from hearing about the past now, do you feel this means that we should maybe stay away from Bellingham and maybe focus with the port just on the community out in the county, the rural areas? Because I want this to succeed, but I don't know if Bellingham, I thought, could be part of the solution. But revisiting it, maybe Bellingham isn't part of this future solution. Maybe the better direction is to go out on with the port, or what are you two thinking?
Go ahead, Christine.
I think it's a really good question, Mike, and I think it's one that we should not answer with our gut feelings. We should do a data-driven analysis around it. And one of the models that I've been looking at is trying to learn from Mason PUD. And they worked with a company called COS Systems. And this company, COS Systems, works actually around the world. They started in Sweden, and Sweden has incredible public fiber. But they have this thing called a demand aggregation tool. It's called their COS service zones. And they basically, they work primarily in rural communities, and they figure out where you should start laying fiber and working, especially if you want to move towards providing last mile fiber. Just kind of from my notes, so larger telecoms, ISPs don't usually want to lay fiber in those low density areas. But by working with COS Systems, Mason County PUD started basically doing their deployment planning so that they could roll out their fiber in places that would make sense financially. So still a lot to learn. I haven't talked to anyone from COS, but I think that could be an interesting firm to look into, or I'm sure there's other firms like them, to start building a business model. And it's true. I mean, maybe the sweet spot that we can fill in is not going to be the densest urban area in our community. We might fill a need in some of these smaller communities that might not otherwise get fiber for a long time. And based on what we've learned from other PUDs, also like Chelan started with their large industrial customers. And so I would also love to see if we could use our existing poles and wires and our existing relationships with Cherry Point Industries to understand if we could fill a need there for large industry, especially as we think about this transition to kind of clean industry and the future of Cherry Point. We're gonna need world-class fiber to do that, is my opinion.
So, like, I'd like to chime in as well. So on the question of what approach, from my perspective, when I became a commissioner, the first thing I did was spend time with Christian. I spent time with Gina Stark. Yeah. So I want to share with everyone that the conversation of how to not get into a wrestling match with the telecoms is a very important conversation. It very much was in Gina's thinking as well, and the port's thinking as well. And that's why they took the particular approach they had to propose and get funded, although clearly the funds are insufficient, as they've discovered, to run a trunk line out to Glacier. That thinking is, became part of my thinking early on too, is that the city has service. One could argue that the city is underserved, and there's a lot of non-competitive behavior in the city, and we can get into that later. But the opportunity where telecoms are not serving, example like small municipalities like Blaine, and certainly Sumas and so on. Communities all along Mount Baker Highway, for sure, and everything in between. So those areas that are not being served are probably would be the biggest societal benefit to communities that are currently not being connected and have any options. So I think that what would be helpful is to have a map. And Jean and I have met and discussed this on several occasions. The idea being creating a financial model or a demand map for the county. And that demand map for the county would show what demand is being covered with colors, meaning the degree to which it's being covered, perhaps leaving it, recognizing that some people are being underserved or some people are being overcharged, but recognizing that they're at least being served. And then sharing that map with the telecom industry and saying, what are you going to serve in the next few years? What are your build-out plans? Making sure we understand that, but then basically saying that, well, everywhere else is where we need to build infrastructure. And obviously today we're allowed to do backbone and everything but the connection. So that we can then decide what an overlap is that the coalition, which coalition means the port, the PUD and the county, enter into to serve the people that are not being served. And that's, so Mike, if you were asked me where should we go, I feel like that's where we should go. We should build this map. We should build a coalition around serving the gap. I don't even use the word gaps because gaps implies there's two things and there's something in the middle that's missing. It's not a gap. We have a little bit of people that are being served and everybody else is not being served. So it's not a gap analysis. It's some other word, a giant hole analysis. So that's how I would say, that's where I think we're at and where we need to go a little bit too.
Good idea, O'Toole. I think getting a map of showing us where service is provided and not where areas may be even weak in their service compared to ones that are strong. I think that's a great starting place. And then it helps us to focus on where the real need is. Yeah, I like that idea.
I think Christine next.
I like that
and then
idea
Steve.
too. And I think, in terms of finding the funding to do that, I know the port's talked about EDI money And I know I'm the one that's sitting on that board now, the EDI board. I would be, well, we don't need to get into next steps, but I think that that's absolutely needed. I think that's something that this company COS does. Like I said, I'm sure there's others, but I like the idea of a firm that's worked with other PUDs before. The other thing I just wanted to mention is that, and I know I've mentioned this to at least Commissioner Dashmani once a few months ago, but I think that one of the things that is unique about Blaine and Sumas compared to other parts of the community is that they're public power communities. They own their poles and wires, and there's strong political support right now for improved broadband access. Their communities have been battered because of the border closure. And so I think that the kind of pole attachment costs and complexity would be lower in those communities.
Yeah, good idea.
Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
Two comments. One is that your thoughts about doing this mapping or whatever term we want to use, and then talk to private providers, the ISPs. Gina's been doing that for the last 3 years, and what she consistently gets is, you know, whether it's Wave or whether it's Ziply or whether it's Comcast, is putting that question out to them and saying, look, we the port has identified an area like Glacier, let's say, as being underserved or unserved. When are you going to provide that service? And, you know, just last week, the last time I did talk to Gina, which was a week ago yesterday, you know, Ziply keeps saying, well, we'll get back to you. Then, you know, and Gina will put this out to them, any or all of the private ISPs, and saying, look, the port's going to build between Deming and Glacier. Would you be willing to partner with us, co-build? Well, no, we're going to do that. We don't want you to overbuild. But they will not commit. And of course they're not going to commit, because as long as they can, you know, keep putting off a public open access system that's going to provide competition to them, they're not going to make a commitment. And my thought is that, and this is what I've told Gina on several occasions, is I think the port's going to do it, or the PUD is going to do it, or some public agency is going to do it. Just make a decision that this area is underserved or unserved, and we're going to build the system out there. Then you're going to provide open access dark fiber to the ISPs. If they want to lease it, then let them lease it. But I don't think that, I think that if we keep thinking that we're going to get some positive response from the ISPs and get them to serve an area that's being right now is underserved or not served in a timely fashion, they're not going to do it, because as Commissioner Grant indicated earlier, I mean, they're not going to go into an area that's so, you know, light, you know, so low density in terms of customers until they can see a return on their investment. I mean, otherwise they'd be in there.
So I want to address this point, and I think it's a very important point about public-private cooperation. Public-private cooperation is not always easier. It's actually more complex than just doing something as a public entity and then leaving space for the private sector to do what it will do. I will say, having lots of experience with public-private cooperation on the private side, it requires a different way of doing business, and both the public entities and the private entities have to be willing to do that. But the way it starts is creating an organization that manages the public-private cooperation, and that's largely what SketchNet does. Because as time goes on, if we want to serve these areas that are unserved, there's no way to proceed in that task without having schadenfreude or later feelings from the private industry that, well, maybe we do want to serve that, or other similar things which create conflict and challenge. But that's why there needs to be a process and a methodology for addressing those ongoing disconnections between private and public entities. And that's why you need an organization to handle that collaboration, because it does require a different kind of organization. It's not the PUD, it's not the port, it's not the county. It's some collaboration thereof with the private sector that's going to be able to manage that public-private cooperation. Now, specifically, one of the things that can be done is by having straightforward and predictable approach to how where the private sector will be allowed to engage and collaborate with the public sector. For example, issuing an RFQ for dark fiber lease agreements in advance, not after it's built. Issuing the RFQ prior to building the fiber line. So, well, if you didn't express an interest, well, the ship sailed. Sorry. And if you respond to the RFQ, you're obviously also committing not to build duplicate infrastructure. So there's ways, organizational ways, and to allow people who choose not to cooperate, for them to be clearly exposed as non-cooperative participants, which nobody in the private or public sector wants to be known as non-cooperative. So there's ways to manage public-private cooperation, and I'm not saying it's easy, but there's no way forward for building fiber in Whatcom County without public-private cooperation. Mike.
Steve, this is addressed to you, Brian too. Am I going to make it too simple if I use water as an example? When we worked with Dave Olson, and we hired him, and we were able to go out and get grant money and other support, and we went to private Group A associations, and we brought them together through Dave's work and your guys' work. We didn't make a penny off that, but we were able to find the money because of being a PUD, that they were able to actually charge customers. They're making some profit off of it, working with their people, but we just brought them a service of good quality, quantity of water, which a lot of places didn't have. Can we use that same kind of idea with broadband? Can we work like Altul is saying with a private company? Maybe we find the money, the grants, but we get that service to those areas that don't have service, and we are supporting those people. Question?
I don't, in all due respect, Commissioner Murphy, I don't think that that's a good example, because you didn't have anybody in the private sector had any interest in helping them. And the grants that we were able to acquire with Dave's leadership were, state grants that were available, but to systems, but those systems did not have the management or technical expertise on staff that Dave was able to provide to get those grants and to coordinate, the project. So I think this would be a different model.
I appreciate that, Steve. I'm just at that point where I'm going to turn over every rock and see what's underneath it to see if we can use it to benefit this. But when I think of the possibilities of community, say EDI money, maybe there's broadband money out there from the state, maybe even the community, from the feds. I think that's money that we can tap into that others cannot. Is that true?
I think that's 95% true. You know, I think there's some, depending upon where the funding, if you refer to like the EDI fund, for instance, that money is only available to public agencies. You know, some of the curb money, state curb money, some of the grants that appears is going to be in the budget this year, if it passed the state budget, that's mostly going to be available to public agencies. Federal, same thing. You know, and I think that one part of your example with Dave Olson might be, you know, considered here, and that is, the commission. We worked with Dave, and we were able to get that first 2-year grant, the $200,000 grant from the State Department of Health to hire Dave and have him work on a number of different applications on behalf of the small water systems. But that was a commitment, you know, that the PUD was able to make because we were able to get that initial $200,000 grant. Once that grant ran out, we thought that the state might be able to continue supporting us and Dave, and of course they were not able to. But the commission decided, you know, last year's budget, this year's budget, you know, to commit to continued funding for Dave to do that work. And just a thought, but you know, we do have the position in our budget for 2021, and for lack of better terms, right now we're simply calling a broadband manager, you know, position. But, and I've said this to the commission, you know, several times over the last several years, whether it's, you know, Dave Olson's work or, you know, economic development work, is that one thing you might consider is making a commitment in our budget to hire a staff person to bring on the capacity, and in terms of time, because I would say in terms of the intellectual capacity, we already have Brian. Brian could certainly manage that process. But in terms of time capacity, we don't have that right now. But make a commitment over this year, next year, and possibly a third year, that we're going to bring a staff person on, and we're going to start to give that person the time to provide this, building this development model in coordination with, especially with the Port of Bellingham, and look at ideas of, as Commissioner Grant has brought up, ideas of grant funding, working with maybe pilot areas like Blaine, Sumas, and possibly Glacier, but and see what a 3-year, maybe a commitment means. And what you're committing to really is that staff person, giving that person time and the ability to start pulling these, I'll call them pieces together. That's not going to happen overnight, but it's a commitment that the commission is making to, let's take a look at what we can do in terms of leadership in the county on broadband. I mean, we talk about working with the port, especially. And we talk, the commissioners have brought up this idea this morning about doing, whatever we want to call it, business model, mapping model, and demand model. One of the things that over the last year or so, working with Gina and Rob Fix and Don Goldberg at the port, it's just constant challenge of, we need to develop a strong, why are we in the game, and what are we willing to do, working with, especially partnering with the port. And does that mean that we're going to lead that effort? Are we going to truly partner with them and develop a management model? Or are we simply going to be there when the port says, what can the PUD do? And I think that making a commitment, a financial commitment, bringing a staff person on. We've also got, I think, $75,000 in our budget to do whatever we want to call, the feasibility study, management model, whatever it is. look at that as a commitment and move forward and say, okay, let's bring that person on. And here is what we want that person to concentrate on in the next 6 months.
So I have an answer to that, an idea, at least, and that idea is that $75,000 should be used to create that map that I talked about earlier. And the new employee job should be, you solve this map. You basically figure out a plan to serve this unserved region. Working with working with the private sector to do that.
Well, I think that could be the first step, but I think that looking down the road 6 months or 9 months, does that take us to the point of having our own development model for Whatcom County in terms of fiber, all that? Because the port, it's almost 2.5 years ago they conducted their own quote feasibility study. I know it's not exactly the same, but what they did is they hired a consultant that said, where are folks underserved or unserved in the county, and where should you build that system? So how do we use this? I'm not suggesting that your idea is not a good one, but is that what we take then to basically update that feasibility that needs assessment and then build a model? Okay, where do we build from? And I think that at the same time that supports, the working, as you said, working with the ISPs, because if there's a commitment, a public commitment by the PUD to take that approach, I think it sends a strong signal to the ISPs, the private ISPs, to go, okay, we're in the game here. So now you created an opportunity for us to, realistically and feasibly sit down with those ISPs and say, okay, just some thought.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, for sharing that. I didn't realize the port has spent the past 2.5 years on that. I'd like to know what fellow commissioners feel about, and this is just an ideal tool, is maybe us revisiting our strategic plan and the three of us decide where we want to go. What's our priorities? What's 1, 2, 3, and on down? And do we put money to it as well as time on it? I mean, honestly, I'd like to see something happen in 21. But if we don't say that, and if we don't dedicate money, or if we don't make it our priority, it's not going to happen. But yet we're dealing with so many important things, water issues as well as other issues, customers, that it's kind of hard right now for me to say, let's do this, when Steve and staff know how much commitment they're making already and everything. And we're just saying, do this. We're just adding to them. So I don't know what you think about revisiting everything and seeing what kind of load do we have on staff and Steve, and how we should direct that.
So my feeling on that, on your comment as well as Steve's comment, is that so yes, Gina did initiate an analysis, and that analysis is completed, and that's what justified their decision to build a trunk line to Glacier. The reason that trunk line isn't built is partially due to the costs. Building that line ended up being much more than expected, and the single most important contributor to that cost is a $50,000 per pole attachment fee from PSC. And
Can you say that again? How much?
$50,000 per pole replacement. So why it's so high is because that which increases the cost of pole attachment. So poles that PSC determines not need replacement, it's much cheaper, obviously, to attach to the pole. To attach to a pole that PSC needs to says needs to be replaced is $50,000, and that adds up. So the cost of aerial conveyance has gone up dramatically, and That is part of the reason why another reason why the fiber net has not been built yet. Gina herself is saying, though, that the level of work that we've done initially was not sufficient to answer this public-private participation question. And so that is why, again, using slightly different terminology, she and I have settled on a next stage of study that's necessary that would actually quantify the financial revenue. It requires a higher level of resolution to be able to determine in the analysis of countywide level of service. So just to clarify, there's no, it's part of the flow to do this work. And it's part of the flow for us to hire a telecom manager to figure out how to serve the areas that are determined to be underserved. And that's completely consistent with our current strategic plan. It's completely consistent with our current budget. We just need to do it.
Okay, I was interested in what Christine said about Blaine and Sumas, because they do provide their own power. They do have support from the public in their job. Would that be the better place for us to focus in on instead of some of these other rural areas, as you said, the port already tried to go to? What do you think?
Christine?
You know, it's not something that I have done a tremendous amount of analysis on, other than understanding that the pole attachments add a lot of cost and complexity based on other PUDs that I've talked to and talked to Gina. And I mean, the other thing that we have to, making policy about technology is hard because it's constantly changing. And then the state policy is also shifting. So I know from the Wakuta Telecom Committee meeting I was on last week that there's likely to be a bill about pole attachments. I didn't get any other details on that. We also know that PUDs could get retail authority in this legislative session. We don't know what that would look like. We know that the state representative that's introducing it, one of his goals is to increase competition. But again, the bill hasn't dropped yet, so we don't know the details of it. I think that what I would feel like is, I think moving as quickly as possible on the telecom hire to me makes sense. And I know that it's hard because we don't know exactly what we need, but some of the characteristics that I think would be really important in that hire are, some technical understanding of this topic. Somebody that's built a community broadband network somewhere would be ideal. In addition to somebody that has the ability to write grants and think through some of this financing. So again, I think one of the key advantages we have as a PUD and a public agency focused on mission, on serving our community, is those grants. And I can't really keep track of all the different funding opportunities that I'm hearing about. There's even private foundations and philanthropies now that are getting involved in bridging the digital divide. So I think we need to get really scrappy about finding financing and then figuring out where that financing fits with this map and this kind of business model that Atul is talking about. So it's kind of like we need to match the two. And it's going to take a lot of staff. It's going to be a lot of work, which is why the staff hire to me is important. And so again, one of the topics that I brought up was maybe getting a little bit of update on the timing around that, and then what staff needs from us, the commission, to kind of get that job description out in the world, if we're ready to move forward with it. So but Blaine and Sumas, like back to your initial question, Mike, to me, I think there is some sense in starting there. But we need the numbers. The numbers will tell the true story.
Good, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. And here's my problem as a commissioner and 26 years in the educational system. I'm here for the kids, so to speak, and it takes teachers to educate the kids. And right now, from what I'm hearing from teachers, and one of the best people to speak on this is probably Steve, because he could probably give us a lot of insight of what's going on in Linden, is we don't have time to wait. I understand waiting, I understand, but the seriousness to me is if we skip a child's year or 2 years, then what are we setting them up for? And I think that's failure. We're setting teachers up for failure if they can't reach their students and get the proper information to them and have that commitment of one-on-one with them, which I'm hearing teachers are having a tough time with that online. I don't know the answer, the solution. I just know we don't have a lot of time to wait. So I'd appreciate as much as we could move forward as fast as we could, developing a plan to say, here's what we're going to do by whatever timeline. I'll get off my soapbox.
Christine, you had something?
Well, Mike, I'm a teacher. I'm an educator. I got booted off my class yesterday for I don't know why. I had to connect with my wife, but my phone hotspot, which is probably going to cost me an arm and a leg, and when the bill comes due. So I'm with you. I'm all about it, and I think, you know, I worked on a big program a few years ago, and we needed to get out and serve the community. I won't go into all the details. And there was this feeling of let's plan. Let's get it perfect. And eventually we just had to go out and serve the first home. And it wasn't perfect, but we learned and we got better. And so another thing you're going to hear from me again and again and again is dream big, start small. Could we run fiber to 5 homes and start working on setting up a local utility district like Mason PUD has, because that's 5 people that might really need help that we could help. Yeah. And so as an organization, we would learn all kinds of things. And so I don't know enough about what I went out in the field with Dwayne and I saw, okay, we own these poles, but I don't know what a mini pilot. I mean, maybe we should start with a 1 mile pilot with poles that we own. I don't have my map that Dwayne gave me, so I can't tell you what road it is. But I mean, that's kind of the scale that I'm thinking of is if we can start really small, we'll learn a lot. And that's another that's kind of where my instincts are sometimes on these things. So again, I'll get off my soapbox now.
Go ahead, Steve.
Just a thought. I'm very pleased that Commissioner Murphy brought up education and being on the Linden School Board for the last 11 years now, and especially the last 2 years with the issues that the pandemic has how it's impacted our opportunities to connect with students. One thought that I've had over the last month or so in thinking about not specifically today's meeting, but your discussion on where the PUD should go, and that is everything that you've talked about this morning in the last few minutes about, bringing someone on staff, doing this mapping, identifying, Commissioner Grant just said, identifying all, let's start here first, is making education and our support, the fiber optics broadband support for education systems in the county, #1 priority. And I think that with all the work that Gina has done over the last year or so, working with CARE Act funding and working with school districts, I think she's built a good relationship with school districts, superintendents, IT folks. And that would be a great place to start, is making that a priority. Because I think that also also helps us identify areas of the county that she's already identified. And I would say mostly East Rural County as the greatest need. But looking at that as the first, priority, and then take that and then build off of that to look at possible pilot areas and maybe a pilot project in East County. Maybe it's the Glacier, Deming to Glacier. Maybe it's the Highway 9 down to Acme, picking up the Nooksack tribal needs. And then, Blaine and Sumas and possibly Cherry Point. I mean, we were contacted the other day by Wave. They really need a crossing from the north to the south under Grandview, and asking if there's something that we could help, work with them on making that happen. So I'm just saying that I think that may be a good place to start, bringing someone on, a staff person on, start building that model, working on, as Commissioner Grant indicated, working on grants, but also having a staff person that can work on a day-to-day basis with the Port of Bellingham and making sure that we can build that effort together. So just some thoughts.
I'd like to have a check-in here on our meeting. Christine, you had raised several topics of discussion. I want to check to see with you to what degree we've covered those, or if you'd like to direct the conversation a little bit here about to address one of the points that you raised that you'd like to discuss today. You're muted, yeah.
I know. Someday we'll all remember to unmute. Okay, I feel like a lot of my points have been covered in this conversation. I think the one other thing I wanted to share is that in November, I read about several communities, and this is not something I'm suggesting. I merely want to put this out here so we know about it as a tool. Is that there were a lot of non-binding referendum questions on various ballots around the country related to broadband. There were some ballot initiatives related to building public fiber networks, but some communities simply asked questions like, should our county ensure that the entire community have access to affordable broadband, things like that. And I know that as a PUD, we do have the ability to put questions on the ballot. And so I don't know that that's something that's important, but I do know that having data points about where the community stands is a really good way of building coalitions and building partnerships. And so it was just something that I wanted to share that we should have in our toolbox of tools.
Okay. How do we acquire that? I mean, what do we need to do to be able to have those tools available?
If you're looking for an advisory ballot, the process generally is, we reach out to the county elections office, figure out their timing. It's usually May or depending which election you want to put it on. And then you pass a resolution and you end up funding that ballot measure, but it's an advisory ballot. It doesn't have the force of law, and you write the ballot. We work through the prosecuting attorney's office on the language after you propose the ballot, and then it gets put on the ballot for a vote.
Has the PUD ever done an advisory ballot?
Not in my tenure.
So John, obviously you work for lots of public entities. What's the cost of an advisory ballot?
I think an election countywide, and Steve might speak to this, but I think for a countywide election on your measure, you would likely be assessed somewhere in the $30,000 range. That's my recollection.
More like
the last kind of cost.
More like
100. So,
Steve, I'm sorry, would you clarify?
I'm sorry, I would suggest it'd be around $100,000 because if we look at the election costs, the PUD's election costs for commission on a countywide If it's combined with a general election, and with no primary, it has run about half of that. But if you had a primary or if you go to a countywide without it and being in a general election where you're spreading those costs, I think the last time was 98,000.
According to the county's calendar, I have April 27th is the special election. And the last day for submittals of resolutions is February 26th.
And that'd be a cost where you'd be bearing most of the full cost of that election because it's a special, and you don't have a general election, I don't believe, in 2021. So, if you're trying to reduce the costs, you're looking at 2022, most likely. November 2022.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
And I have
So-
done, the last advisory ballot I did, Commissioner, you asked, was Blaine Airport for the city of Blaine.
Okay. So I had a list. It was, I'm recognizing it was quite technical, and I wanted to bring those topics up, not so much that we would go into depth and discuss those, but it has occurred to me that given the time that we've consumed to this point, I'd like to focus on 2 points that in the points that I listed, and that's dig once and speed testing. But I think, Steve, you had your hand up.
Oh, I just, Annette just emailed me and she said our last election cost that included a primary was $140,000.
Thank you, Nat. So on the subject of dig once and speed test, I got a request from John Humphreys. He'd like to talk about that subject. Is there a way we can listen to him for a few minutes and talk about those two subjects? Can we make that allowance, Steve?
Can we, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
On the subject of speed testing and dig once, I'd like to hear from John, who's in the participants, not in the participants, he's in the listeners. Can we promote him to make a brief comment on those two subjects?
Well, I mean, it's you can do that, but the way you set this meeting up was that it was not going to have any public comment.
Yeah, I don't want to break any rules. My question is that it would be helpful for me from what I want to talk about if I could get his help and talk about those two technical subjects.
Well, I think you'd be violating the terms of how you set this meeting up because you.
Okay, yeah, I don't want to do that then. Thanks for that. That's why I'm asking you. Okay, so I'll do my best. So on the subject of speed testing and dig once, I'll first talk about speed testing. So one of the things, and I guess I'll go back to what I can uniquely talk about, because I worked for a car company in powertrain development for many years. I have lots of experience with powertrain test and design too. And one of the things that I find remarkable is that in the telecom industry, we use a test that basically tells the ability to send a burst of data. It's like deciding which car you're going to buy based on how it does wide open throttle from a stoplight. Now that's fun. I admit it. I've done it. I don't know how many of you like to do that with a vehicle or would admit it, but that really doesn't tell you anything about how the car drives. It's a very incomplete, unrepresentative, not related to real world. I mean, I don't know how everybody else here drives, but very few of us are repeatedly doing wide open throttles from stop signs, right? I mean, Steve, maybe I don't want to speak for you, but anyway, the fact is that's not how we drive. So the reality, in the same way, it's important to have a representative duty cycle to evaluate what an individual's connection is to the internet. And ironically, that's a very hard, politically difficult thing to do apparently in Washington State, because I've raised it with Russ, the head of the broadband office, and I've had conversations with folks in the telecom industry and as well as other commissioners. And it sounds to me like there is this strange resistance to the idea of having a better test. And that doesn't mean I'm not interested in it still. The fact of the matter is that having used the speed test tool and comparing it to a more realistic duty cycle test of connection, the most important condemning fact about speed tests is this, is that whenever you're using something to test, even if it's a bad test, it can be useful if it tells you the directional improvement from one place to another. What I've discovered is that speed test doesn't do that. Meaning if I test something right here, and if I go to my neighbor and do the same test with speed test, the data that I will get that maybe he has better connectivity than I do is not true. That test will not actually tell you that that spot is a better connection than my spot. That's how bad of a test it is. So now is speed test completely useless? No. And the reason it's not completely useless is because we have the benefit of statistics. That when you collect data in enough aggregation, even really, really bad tests still tell you how the system behaves as a whole. So I'm not saying we should stop using speed tests because it's very quick and easy to use. But the boundaries of the served and unserved regions in our community will not be discovered with speed test. The degrees of service will not be discovered by speed test. So I think it's imperative for us to have a better testing methodology. It's not expensive to do so. Background in testing, yes, I have. I don't have background in the specifics of, expertise in testing of internet connection, but it's something that I wanted to raise to the commission and see what their thoughts were on the subject. No comments.
Commissioner Desmani,
Oh, yes.
Good, Brad.
one comment I'll make, and I'm definitely do not have any expertise in testing, so we'll set that aside, but it becomes an important concept when we start looking at, say, mapping underserved or non-served areas, kind of tying into the vision of what we're trying to accomplish. If you look at the FCC standard for whether or not you're adequately served, they're talking about 25 megabits download and 3 megabits upload, which is extremely low speed. If you look at the state of Washington, the legislation passed in 2019 on broadband, the state of Washington's goal for determining whether or not someone of these adequately served with high-speed broadband is 150 megabytes down and up. So there's this huge gap between the federal agency and the state in terms of what they see as being adequately served. So I just offer that because that kind of plays into this discussion.
For sure it does. Specifically, I have compared A to B, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but the up and down served number with speed test versus a more realistic load test was an order of magnitude different on occasion. So clearly, it's fair to say that speed tests will typically produce a higher result, but not always, by the way.
Well, I mean, I think, as I always say, I mean, I think the more we we can understand about the problem that we're trying to solve, the better. And you know, I agree with Brian too. You know, what I've heard from the more knowledgeable people in our community about this is that our need for bandwidth is doubling every year approximately. And so, you know, most homes are going to want speeds of, you know, at least 200 megabits per second. And we're going to want much higher upload speeds too. And so, so technologies that are bringing less than 100 megabits per second are going to be obsolete within 10 years or so. So not totally related to speed testing, but you know, kind of thinking about the future and what we need.
That's why I'm bringing this. So I get the high level policy goals that Brian and you and Christine both talked about, and I'm very happy about that. And speed test is a useful tool for addressing large aggregations of people.
Okay.
What their data rates are, because the glory of statistics. Statistics, if you get enough sample size, a lot of things get washed out, including flaws in data testing methodologies. What I'm really focusing on, though, we're talking about our community.
Mm-hmm.
And the resolution of the map that you would produce using speed test. Really what I'm getting at is the map I talked about earlier. The resolution of that map will be terrible, will be wrong. The boundaries will be wrong if you use speed test to produce that map. That's what I'm trying to get at.
And when you say speed test, do you mean like when I go to my
That's a
computer
particular
and I
algorithm.
put speed test in?
It's a de facto nationwide tool for you know, like when the broadband office set out its link saying, hey, test your internet connection, that was speed test.
Okay.
That's how testing is done across the nation typically.
Okay. And so
I'm just saying that
think we should use a more accurate speed test in Whatcom County as we try to define the need in our community?
Not just us. I think every PUD and every entity interested in serving people, actual people, not aggregates, you know, I mean, should have a higher resolution tool to figure out where things are at. And the other thing that the tool like this does is it discourages cheating. And I don't mean cheating in like an intentional way, but well, I'm sure VW would say that they weren't cheating intentionally. It's just that they optimize their control system for the particular drive cycle. So even then that can be done, right? So there's at Ford, we worked on powertrains, and we knew as engineers who were designing and developing powertrains that how the drive cycles worked. We all knew, and we all knew that that there were algorithmic ways to defeat the intention of the EPA in their drive cycle. It just only VW engineers had the guts to do it, apparently, to actually go through and write a control system that actually cheated, that knew it was on the EPA drive cycle, and that would essentially recalibrate the engine so it would perform better to the EPA's liking when it was on the test cell, and then would not do that when people are driving it. So I'm not saying that it's not possible for a better tool to not work. In all, I mean, there might be cases where it also would have flaws and would not work, is what I'm trying to say. But we need better testing, because the one house to the next kind of variation, or one neighborhood to another neighborhood variation, will not be captured by speed tests, is what I'm trying to get at.
How do we find a speed test that is better, and how do we make sure that it's accurate?
So there, you know, there's the Open Software Foundation related groups have already developed tests. It just needs to be, we just need to agree to use it. and using it requires some scripts and things like that, but it's not hard to do.
Okay.
Or expensive. I just want to make that a priority when we do the mapping exercise, to use more than one testing tool for the purpose of testing this speed.
That makes sense to me.
Mike, what are your thoughts on that subject?
Well, to be honest with you, when you first came up with the speed test, I do not have any knowledge or experience in this area like the two of you do, but you did a good job of using the car. My youth reminds me of that. But now that I've listened to the two of you and Brian talk about it, in fact, I was interested in how Brian said the state, I believe, Brian, you said was 150. And Christine, you said that more or less we need around 200. I think you said speed of megabytes. I'm starting to understand what speed testing is. Right now, I'm still learning, but it seems to be a tool that is needed for us to have a good understanding of what's needed in Whatcom County. And I like the idea that we just don't go with one. All two of you are saying that there's other sources of information regarding speed testing, that we should have an open mind to all of them instead of just one.
Yeah, and specifically, actually, I got some information from John. I wrote it up actually, and I'll after this is over, maybe what I'll do is I'll send it to Steve, and then Steve, could you send that memo out to the commission for me?
Yes, certainly.
Okay, so as follow up to the conversation on speed test. The other topic I wanted to bring up is dig once. It's occurred to me that if we would have enacted a dig once policy back in 2000, for example, and I please forgive me, people that who were involved back then. It's always easy to second guess, right? After the benefit of time and experience, it's always easy to go back and say, oh, well, we could have done this and it would have been better. So I completely understand that, and I completely respect that. But it's occurred to me that if in 2000, and if we would have instead used our resources to implement the dig once policy for the county, boy, we'd be way ahead than where we are today. And what I mean by that, what I mean by resources, well, to lay conduit costs money. And if we said to the city, the county, the port, that, hey, wait, every time you do, and including us, every time you lay pipe, every time you dig a trench of any kind, we want to have the opportunity to lay conduit at the same time, because that conduit can later be used for fiber optic cable. Boy, we'd be way ahead. If you think about every road project that's happened in the county, the Olympics, all the people who wanted to go to the Olympics and had to drive up Guide Meridian, that's a facetious comment. All of the things that happened in our community, as far as road construction and other things, how it would have been beneficial to have conduit in all of those places. That would have cost money. And that's one of the reasons why implementing a dig one policy hasn't happened, because it's an incremental cost, and it's an incremental hassle to municipalities and other local governments to put conduit in the ground. But having said that, it's never too late to do the right thing. And I'm wondering if, and this doesn't actually deliver results in terms of actual data. A dig once policy doesn't do that, because it's not going to actually get data to kids who are in school. But it will make life easier for the people who succeed us in local government to do what they need to do. And for that reason, I think it's worth considering really pushing for dig once policy countywide, and maybe being the entity that finances that incremental hassle and cost. Because it is an investment. Like if properly built, that conduit will be usable for many years, hopefully a century. And so I think that it's worth considering, and I wanted to bring it to the attention of the commission and hear everyone's thoughts about it. Go ahead, Steve.
I think you've identified an area that has been a challenge for the PUD in the last 20 years and not directly related to fiber or electricity, but water. And that, early on, Commissioner Murphy brought up Dave Olson and his work with all the water systems, the associations in the county, and working with these water associations. At least my experience over the last 15 years here at the PUD is that the same issue when a water association has to replace a pipe under Badger Road. And what we identified through a grant that Dave was able to get from Department of Health to do just what you're saying, lay that extra 6-inch conduit alongside the 12-inch water line under Badger Road. And that would have, in that one case, that would never have happened if the PUD was not able to get enough grant money to pay for that extra conduit and do the boring and so forth. But this is an issue that's not just fiber related. It's, water associations, water systems throughout all of the Whatcom County west of the mountain, they're faced with this almost monthly. And Dave works with these water associations, on projects like that. Had one just in the last few months, just east of I-5, just south of Birch Bay Linden Road, where the water association had to replace and move a 12-inch water pipe because the state was replacing culverts, and the state would not pay that water association the cost of moving the pipe. All I'm saying is that it's, identifying those areas and then creating the financial infrastructure and management infrastructure, if it would be the PUD, to help address just what you're saying, whether we want to call it dig once or what we want to call it, good.
Conduit, yeah, whatever, yeah.
Yeah, it's critical. Yeah. And water is, I would suggest in the next 20 years, water infrastructure is going to be a key example of that. And the opportunity, though, is to, when, Water Association X replaces 3 miles of pipeline that's in county road right away, then is the PUD, willing to lead an effort to put that 6-inch conduit in so that you can put fiber into it. But it's going to be a key opportunity as well as a key challenge.
Thank you, Steve.
I am supportive. I understand the long-term payoff of Dig Once policies and agree with you that if we'd been doing this for 20 years, things would be different now. I don't understand the role that the PUD would play. In some ways, don't we need just a county-wide Dig Once policy and Dig Once policies in every municipality in our community to make this work? Is that, walk me through more what the PUD would do.
There's a cost implication to Dig Once policies.
Okay.
And so that's one of the reasons why Dig Once policies don't get implemented. So if
Okay.
there was one entity that handled the cost aspect, that could be beneficial, just bringing it up. So.
Okay.
I think what Steve was speaking to was, compared to the city of Bellingham, you have a very fractured utility system in the county. Different water purveyors, You may not have sewer purveyors, different electrical purveyors. You have a county road system that does not build at urban standards. It may be doing an overlay on chip seals that doesn't cut into the roadbed when they do road projects, versus a city of Bellingham that has a much more urbanized system and is the utility provider. So there's a different utility construct for delivery in the county, the non-urban areas, if you will, or outside of the city jurisdictions. So it's a much more fractured system. While the PUD went through some effort to get countywide franchises for water and electrical service a couple years ago, it has no way of knowing when a county does a road project. You know, it would take a county policy, a county directive to make its bidding process on a road project to say, we're going to do a dig once and allow you to go put conduit in, and then who's going to pay, as Commissioner Deshmani. So it's a much more fractured and difficult to organize, and it would take a lot of county leadership at the Whatcom County to implement.
And just an example of where that would have been extremely beneficial. I think it was about 17 years ago, because it was a year or so before I came on here. And in all the engineering and design and planning for the widening of the Guide Meridian,
For the Olympics.
the PUD, Tom Anderson's leadership, pushed really, really hard to those water associations and to the city of Bellingham at the time to lay water pipeline in the guide at, before it was constructed, so that in the future you could see an easy transition and interconnect between the city of Bellingham, moving up the guide all the way to all the way up to the border, and potentially intertying all those water associations together. And Tom met with extreme pushback by most of those water associations and said, we're not interested. And so, the guide was completely rebuilt, and now you continue to have, a half a mile gap between A system, a half a mile gap between C system and D system. And I think this concept that you're talking about right now, yeah, it needs leadership by all the municipalities as well as the county, that working together to develop that, that dig once policy, and then identify those opportunities where, a much lower cost investment in that, in the conduit or piping today, albeit may be seen by some as a fool's mission, but eventually it definitely would pay off.
Yeah, this policy initiative goes beyond, I think, just the goal that you would express. It's a county necessary to implement and have a priority as a policy. But for large projects like the guide that, the Vancouver Olympics for 2010, that project, the thinking of that project started probably in the 1990s. And that was involved federal funding and federal scope on the work and state scope on the work for the Department of Transportation. So allowing then all of a sudden at the late in the time frame to have the county to say, we have a dig first, dig once policy, and we want that into your bid program specs. That train may have left the station because it wasn't in the state scope at DOT for doing the project. So there's a lot of layers of transportation planning that policy has to be a priority policy to implement through the process of what can be 10, 15-year projects. So it's something that you would take up probably with the COG, as well as a transportation planning group, and at the county level as well, to try to pursue the policy.
Okay, and our representative of the COG is Christine, I believe, and I think I'm getting from this that what I will do is I'll talk to I have a meeting with the county executive this week to cover a couple of different items. I will talk to the county executive about this and report back to the commission at our regular meeting in my commissioner comments. about Dig Once policy. If I think that what I could see is a countywide task force on Dig Once. And perhaps the PUD could lead it, but we'd want public works people from the city and the county, and then of course we would want the port involved too. But I think I'd like to see what some of the electeds think about the subject first. So I mean that covers what I intended to cover today. I wanted to check in now to see if there's other topics that we should cover. Steve, go ahead.
Commissioner Desmati, as you meet with county executive, another place where I think that discussion would be well placed would be with the small cities group that meets monthly, and because the county attends those meetings, and I know that the city of Bellingham occasionally attends those meetings, but I think that putting this subject on their agenda, at a future meeting would be a great place to bring all the cities and the county together along with the PUD to have that discussion.
Are you suggesting that in the near future, but waiting to after we discuss it further at our next meeting?
Yeah, that's what I would suggest. I think that if you're going to have a discussion with the county executive on this and other matters, I think it would be great if you and the county executive would ask to have this subject on a future small cities meeting agenda, because I think.
I see. Okay. I will do so. I'll bring it up. So let's follow up to this meeting. I guess I want to now think about what are our next steps. We discussed a lot of items. We're not intending to make any decisions today. Obviously, this will guide the conversation we had here today, will guide decisions for the future. That's the purpose of having these conversations. My question to the commissioners is, where do we go from here? I mean, some obvious things did pop out is another pebble on Brian's various balancing acts that he has to manage what receives priority of his time, putting another pebble in the bin that is writing a position description for a telecom manager. That's an obvious one to me. The planning of this next study, that's something that needs attention. Because we don't have that staff person, I think we have to rely on the commission and the staff that we have, and Gina. So perhaps we need to have a conversation with Gina on that study, where maybe I and as you and Brian and then Gina get together and talk about the details of that study, and maybe propose, figure out who's going to do it. And I wonder, I did talk to her about that in a call a few months ago, and she said that her consultant might be able to do it, and she'd go about the task of finding a suitable person. But maybe we could have that conversation as a second follow-up to this meeting. Are there other follow-ups?
Well, related to that, I am wondering about, Gina had mentioned to me a request to for EDI funds for that study. And I think, her question for me was, does the PUD want to be involved in that request? And so it sounds like we very much do. And so if I could just stay in the loop, because so that I can help with any requests to the EDI board.
If it's involving EDI, if I may, sorry to interrupt you, Gina. I mean, Christine. I had Gina on my mind. But if maybe you should have that meeting with staff and Gina Stark instead of me then, because yeah, you're involved in the EDI process. So
I'm happy to, and I feel like I owe Gina a follow-up too. So I will be in touch with you, Steve. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. And-
Brian, I have a question for Brian, if that's all right. Is Brian still on?
No, Brian had to get off. He has to tend to a health issue with his wife's recent surgery. So
Okay, yeah, no problem. So, wishing that well. So, go ahead, Steve.
I was just going to suggest that the next step for, at least for staff, I think Brian's been doing some work on the job description for that telecom manager, if that's what we want to call it at this point. I would suggest that we finalize that and get it back to you and lay out a process, a time process as to how we can attract someone to that position. And then a follow-up to what Commissioner Grant just indicated, meeting with Gina and talking about next step in terms of the study, but also how the port was and is planning on approaching EDI on not just the cost of doing this study, but I think they were also going to be asking for additional funds to try to support that, what they see as the first leg of their work, and that would be the Glacier project. It's my understanding that they were going to bring something to the EDI board sometime first quarter. And I think that, so our discussion with them in trying to make sure that whatever their request is, it would include, support from us, but identify what the components of that request are and why are they making it at this time? So.
Are there follow-ups that folks would like to identify, staff or commissioners?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that.
Are there other follow-ups that anyone would like to offer for consideration, if staff or commissions?
I don't have anything else at this time. Just a sort of a broader comment here, and that is when we talk about the EDI board and funding for this component of the broadband, I would also just want to plan in your mind some further discussion that we need to have about, and I think that hiring this person for telecommunications management fits into our previous discussion some year ago, and that is about this community services group within the PUD organization, and that we want to talk about not only funding for the telecommunication staff, but also water resources. I've had some discussion with the county executive about economic development and what role the PUD can or is willing to play, especially around Cherry Point and infrastructure out there. All I'm suggesting is that I think I'm offering that one of the next steps that I can bring back to you is a much more higher level of clarity on what that community services group could look like and timing on staffing and so forth. So.
Okay, all right. Mike, do you have anything that you'd like to cover today that hasn't been covered? Next steps or other?
Thanks, Altu. I would just say to Steve and to all of us is that as we move forward talking about different issues, and broadband seems to be gaining some momentum. I don't know what that does to staff at the PUD. If we hire a person, do telecommunication, what does that person need? Obvious in office and everything else. I think we have that already. But do they need staff? Do they need people work with them? If they need help or people to work with them, or do we hire people? It's all has a cost attached to it. So I would still like to go back and say, I'd like to revisit our strategic planning, because that's what we work off of. And then also our budget connected to that strategic planning. Does something have to give to make this happen? I don't know that. I will need to hear that from staff. And it's not fair to them to keep loading more on them. We just need to know how to organize that load for them or remove some of it. But there are some critical things we're doing in Whatcom County. I'd hate to drop those now because we're recommending staff to move forward in this different direction. So caution as well as information for us to make the best decision, I think.
Thank you for bringing that up again, because it's something that that you had raised earlier in this meeting, and you've certainly raised in now with your explanation just now, recognizing it's consistent with the theme that you've been talking about. And what I'd like to suggest is that Commissioner Murphy, that perhaps we could craft an item on the agenda, or it could be a special meeting, or it could be an item on our upcoming agenda, which addresses this collection of concerns that you raised around budget, strategic planning, and perhaps could follow up with Steve to discuss it, and we could incorporate that into our upcoming agendas.
Yeah, if you would meet with Steve and the two of you come up with a plan, to present to the board, that'd be great. I appreciate that.
No, but I'm actually suggesting slightly different, is that you craft how the board addressed that. You take the lead of crafting how the board addressed that particular issue, because I'm acknowledging that it's it's important, but the insights about how it's important and how to address that concern, I don't think I have them. I think you do.
Okay.
So if you and Steve could figure out how to address the issues of strategic plan, budget, and all that, and how we deal with that as an evolving organization, and then the commission could address that in an upcoming meeting or a special meeting.
Okay, I can do that. Thank you.
I'd be glad to work with Mike, and one thought I had listening to your discussion is to take a look, for me and Mike, to go back, take a look at the last rendition of the strategic plan, and then take a look at what you and Jeff and staff developed for the 2021 budget. Take a look at the community services group concept that we laid out when you last updated the strategic plan, and then take a look at this year's budget, and then highlight as best we can, okay, how do we move forward with staffing, with funding, over the next 6 to 9 months or a year, and how it, and literally lay out a timeline on staff hiring and decision-making that we think you'd need to make, and bring that back to you for a lengthy discussion that first meeting in February.
Okay, well, is there anything else for the good of the order? Well, thank you all. Thanks the people who sat in and listened on the conversation. We didn't take public comment. I'd recommend that if you aren't able to attend a regular meeting of the PUD and you still want to comment on today's session in which you participate in, send us an email. Steve, who do they send that email to?
You can send it to me, and I can distribute it. And I understand during the discussion, John Humphreys did send a lengthy email to to me. And so I will
Okay.
forward that to you all. So
Great, great. And of course, our next meeting is our regularly scheduled meeting a week from today at 8 a.m. And thanks, everyone. Thanks, staff. Thank you, Ann, for stepping in and being the pinch hitter on a couple of occasions. And I think let's call the meeting closed. Do we need to make a motion to do that?
no.
Okay, well, thank you all, and let's end the meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.